Hi everyone, this is the lecture on the parts of the brain other than the cerebrum. So your essential question is, what are the other parts of the brain besides the cerebrum and what do they do? And by the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer this question using all of these terms. So there are three parts of the brain that we're talking about here: the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And let me show you where those three regions are. So if you cut the brain along the mid-sagittal plane, meaning you like parted your hair down the middle and then cut along your hairline, then you'd be separating the left half of your brain from the right half of your brain, and this is what it would look like. So here's your skull, your scalp and your skull. You have some fluid circulating everywhere, but then encased within that is the brain. And then remember, we've cut the brain in half mid-sagittally, and so looking deeper, you have the corpus callosum that connects the right half to the left half, and then underneath that, you have this area called the diencephalon. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about today. And then below the diencephalon, here's the diencephalon. Below that, you have the brainstem, which is this region here. And then that leads into the spinal cord. And then you also can see posterior to the brainstem, you have the cerebellum, which looks kind of like a mini cauliflower, and it's got its own gray and white matter. And then you can see there's cerebrospinal fluid, this blue fluid that's circulating around and within the little spaces, these ventricles that you see here, to protect the brain. Okay, so we're going to start with the diencephalon, and there are three parts to it that you need to know. What does the diencephalon do? It kind of does a lot of different things, and it's hard to have a very clean connection between all of those things. So you just simply have to memorize what it does. But the first structure you have to know about is the thalamus. And the thalamus is this oval region right here. So I tried to highlight it for you in red. You'll notice that it has this little white dot right in the center. That's because you actually have two thalami, one on the left side of your brain, one on the right side of your brain. They're right next to each other, and then they're connected to each other at that white dot. So once again, if you look here, we've cut the brain mid-sagittally, and we're looking at the interior region of that brain. So what does the thalamus do? It's the relay station for sensory impulses that are going up to the sensory cortex. So let's say that you touch something rough. Like, I don't know, you rubbed your hand along a patch of concrete or something. So then the sensory information is going to send action potentials up your sensory neurons, up your arm to your spine, and then those action potentials then get sent to the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to determine where the signal goes from there. So it's going to go to the sensory cortex at the parietal lobe, and then the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe, once it receives the signals appropriately from the thalamus, will be able to tell the rest of your brain, was this a pleasant sensation or was it an unpleasant sensation? So if you're rubbing your hand along the concrete, it's probably going to feel unpleasant to you, and you're going to decide, like, I shouldn't do this. I could rub the skin off of my hand. And so the thalamus is the part of your diencephalon that sent the information to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe then helps to figure out, is this good or is this bad? Okay, next. Here's the thalamus, and then below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. So that's this region that I tried to highlight for you here in red. And the suffix or the prefix hypo means below. So if you have hypothermia, then your body temperature falls below a normal body temperature. Like, let's say if you get caught out in a snowstorm for an extended period of time or something. The hypothalamus is the part of the diencephalon that is below the thalamus. So what does the hypothalamus do? Well, the first thing you should notice is that below the hypothalamus is that pituitary gland. It looks like a very tiny onion just kind of hanging or dangling off of the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland is going to hold all of the hormones not all of them, but it's going to hold a lot of the most important hormones that regulate all of the basic functions of your entire body. So the pituitary gland, when it releases certain hormones into your blood, and those hormones travel throughout your body, that's going to regulate your body temperature. When the pituitary gland releases other hormones, like antidiuretic hormone, that's going to regulate how much water you have in your body, and that might lead to things like you feeling thirsty, and now you have to put water into your body to bring water levels back to normal, or you might feel like you need to go pee because your bladder has been removing water from your blood in response to the signals from the pituitary gland. The hormones that the pituitary holds also can regulate metabolism or appetite. It can regulate sex and pain and pleasure. But the pituitary gland is just a holding sac. What actually triggers the pituitary to release hormones at the right time? It's this region here, the hypothalamus. And so because the hypothalamus triggers the pituitary to release the hormones at the right time, the hypothalamus is actually what is going to control all of these functions. So that's the second region of the diencephalon. The third region, oh, there's the hypothalamus again. So you can see if you go deep inside your brain, you would see this like kind of triangular-ish region here, and dangling from it, there's the pituitary. From this angle, it looks less like an onion and more like maybe other things, but the function is still what I told you about. Okay, so the diencephalon also has this other region called the epithalamus. So the epithalamus, remember that the prefix epi means on top of, right? So your epidermis is the topmost layer of your skin, and the epithalamus is the topmost region of your diencephalon, more or less. And it sits essentially on top of your thalamus. And there are two things that I'm going to point out to you that are part of the epithalamus. And these are not the only important regions of the epithalamus, but they're the only ones that I will be testing you on in my class at Pacifica. So one region is the pineal gland, which you can see right here. I tried to like make a red shape that would kind of encompass the whole region, but it was really hard to do that. So here it is. Here's the pineal gland. It's part of the epithalamus. What does it do? It secretes hormones that basically regulate sleep, right? So they help you go to sleep at the right time. And then the choroid plexus is this reddish region up here. And what does it do? It makes cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid will then flow through all the ventricles and down, past the spinal cord and then around and then back around the brain and stuff like that. Okay, so that's the epithalamus. And once again, the three regions of the diencephalon were the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And those three regions also are known as the interbrain. So the term diencephalon and interbrain are used interchangeably. All right, so here is all of that in words. What did these three regions of the diencephalon or the interbrain do? The thalamus relays sensory information up to the sensory cortex and then helps identify if the sensation is pleasant or unpleasant. The hypothalamus regulates a whole bunch of things like body temperature, metabolism, stuff like that. And it does that by regulating release of hormones from the pituitary gland. And the epithalamus has the pineal gland, which secretes hormones that regulate sleep, as well as the choroid plexus, which basically makes cerebrospinal fluid. One thing that I'm just going to briefly mention here, this is not going to be on your test for my class at Pacifica or on a quiz, but some regions of the diencephalon are also known to be part of what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system also includes a bunch of other things that you see here, right? So there's your hypothalamus, and then you have like all these other things. And together, the limbic system basically regulates emotions. So if you suddenly feel very angry or very sad, and sometimes it might even feel like your emotions are controlling you instead of you controlling them. And that's because your limbic system may still be in development or may be overwhelmed. If you want to learn more about the limbic system, there is a Khan Academy video that I do recommend, and I've linked it down here. Once again, this is optional viewing. It's not part of your quiz or test from my class. Okay, so we've talked about the diencephalon. Now let's get into the brainstem, which includes three regions: the midbrain here, here, and then the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So let's start with the midbrain, which I've boxed for you in red. This is where you're going to find reflex centers for vision and hearing. So a lot of your reflexes are immediate, just automatic responses to what you might see. Like, for example, if a ball is coming towards your head, then your reflex is going to be to block it or catch it or duck, right? And so, or maybe you hear something like a baby crying, and your reflex is going to be to turn your head towards that sound. And so this is where you'll find those reflex centers for vision and hearing. It's going to be in the midbrain right here, immediately below the diencephalon. The pons is the second region of the brainstem. That's this bulbous region here. And this is where you're going to find fiber tracts, so in other words, axon bundles, that control breathing. And so even if you're unconscious, like when you're asleep, your pons is going to regulate breathing so that you continue to oxygenate your body even without your conscious control. I mean, even when you are conscious, you still don't have to think about it. Your pons is regulating it. Next is your medulla oblongata, which I've boxed for you down here underneath the pons. And this controls heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, your swallowing reflex, and your vomiting reflex. So in other words, it controls your other vital functions. Heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, the things that the nurse checks for when you go to the doctor's office for a checkup. Those things are controlled by the medulla oblongata, and they keep you alive even if you have no consciousness or conscious control over them. So you've heard of people going into a coma. If they are unable to think or respond or make decisions or receive input, they still can stay alive for an extended period of time because the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, the pons and the medulla oblongata, enable their vital functions to continue even without control from upper levels of the brain. Last of all, the reticular formation just kind of runs along the entire brainstem, and it basically regulates consciousness and sleep and wake cycles. And so if you had damage here, then you could end up in permanent unconsciousness. You might not be able to wake from essentially a permanent sleep. Okay, so once again, here's all of that in words. The brainstem is made of the midbrain, where you find reflex centers for vision and hearing, the pons, where you'll find fiber tracts that control breathing, the medulla oblongata, which controls these other vital functions like heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, vomiting. And then along the length is the reticular formation, which regulates consciousness and wake-sleep cycles. You'll also, if you cut open the brainstem, it looks like it's pretty much almost all white matter, but there are many small gray matter areas throughout that help to control breathing and blood pressure. Okay, last of all, we're talking about the cerebellum. And so what does it look like? Well, it has two hemispheres, left and right. And when you cut into it, it's going to look like this, where you have these gray matter regions on the outside, and then you have these white matter regions on the inside. And the white matter regions spread out into the gray stuff like a tree. So for that reason, the white matter is called the arbor vitae. Arbor being Latin for tree, and vitae, meaning of life. So the cerebellum, what does it do? It provides timing for muscle activity, it controls balance and equilibrium, and it constantly monitors body position and makes adjustments to keep balance. So, for example, if you are, you know, like moving from a lying down position to a sitting up position, your cerebellum is going to coordinate all of the muscles that are necessary to make that movement in your back, in your torso, or like in your arms to push you up, things like that. So they allow you to move from lying down to sitting. And along the way, you will always know where all of the parts of your body are in space. So you get a sense of what's near you. If you move too far, are you going to touch this or that? Um, and so this is what allows you to have those smooth, controlled movements. Another example would be when you're walking. You put one foot in front of the other, in front of the other, and all of the muscles of your body have to coordinate to allow you to maintain balance and have those smooth motions while you're walking. And also, you need to make sure that you're walking in such a way that you're not knocking into things or falling down or stubbing your toe or stuff like that. So your cerebellum coordinates all of that timing and balance and, you know, knowledge of where the parts of your body are in space. Okay, here are your key takeaways on the interbrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The interbrain also being called the diencephalon. First of all, the diencephalon uses hormones to control many vital autonomic functions of the peripheral nervous system. The thalamus is part of the diencephalon and it relays sensory information to the sensory cortex. The brainstem controls heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. And the brainstem also relays motor and sensory impulses between the brain and the spinal cord. And last of all, the cerebellum controls balance, equilibrium, and proprioception. Proprioception meaning your awareness of where the parts of your body are in three-dimensional space.